Hey everyone, today on Amaranth Bay, we're going to build a big rail yard to serve the public terminal that we built over the last couple of episodes, as well as a nearby transit depot, actually two nearby transit depots, to house the city's new streetcar and bus fleet. I've always had a little bit of trouble, and I think that I've mentioned this before in videos, making rail yards that look good. So, of course, I decided to make a relatively big and a complicated one in this location. The easiest technique I found to get a relatively clean look with the connections here between the tracks is to make one overarching single track to outline the shape of the rail yard that I want, and then just connect those double tracks straight into it. I think that a lot of the struggles I had in the past with making rail yards stemmed from me just overthinking the connections and trying to do things like taper them down from double track to single track before merging them into the outer track. But really, these track assets I'm using from the Railway 2 pack are designed to do these kinds of things naturally without having to put in too much effort. So they usually just look pretty good out of the box. That being said, I did want to have some variations in the connections. So after making sure that I have some space here for the service road, I'm going to have a couple of these tracks taper down in the way I mentioned before into this separate bulb of the lower rail yard. This part is going to taper down on the other end into a single track, which is something that you see in Duluth. I don't know if this is just for like easier switchbacks or something like this, but I do think that it looks nice and adds just a little bit of variation to something that would otherwise get fairly repetitive. With the main track down, I came back and added in some service roads in the remaining spaces so that we can get some utility vehicles driving around, which is just going to bring a little bit of activity to the area. It looks a little bit ugly to have these clean breaks in between the grass and all this gravel. So to smooth that out, I'm going to fill in the smaller areas with gravel using surface painter, and then my theme's oil texture to get a more gravel-like color in the surrounding area, just to make it a little bit less obvious. I'm sure there are plenty of unrealistic things going on here, but I'm still fairly happy overall with how the layout looks, and I think that it adds a nice contrast to the busyness of the public terminal across the road. To go along with that idea, I didn't want to overload this thing with details, but I did think it needed a few things to make it look like it's actually in use. The first thing is, of course, to put down some rail cars that have been staged here. I don't know too much about this sort of operation, so I tried to just make the cars look like they matched with the various industries and storage yards in the port that we haven't already covered in the previous rail yard build, which was a very long time ago in the series now. So I'm going to add a collection of empty center beam cars, which, if you'll remember all the way back to the previous episode, were used to deliver packs of lumber to the main storage yard. Nearby, we have some container cars, of course referencing the big intermodal part of the terminal. Someone mentioned in the comments a while ago that this kind of flat car is more used for single stack containers, like in Europe and other places, and that you use like deeper well cars for double stack containers. So I might come back and replace those with the more accurate kind, but for now these are gonna do well enough as a stand-in, I think. And they don't really bother me too much because I just don't know that much about trains, and ignorance is bliss. In the smaller rail yard, we're gonna get some of these gondola cars filled with stuff, and these are being staged here for a small build that we'll get to near the end of the episode. There's just going to be a sprinkling of other details in the rail yard because, like I said, I don't want this area to be too busy. So there's a small grove of trees here to separate the rail yard from the main avenue. Not that that's really necessary in an industrial area, but I think that it just looks better than a plain embankment. Even with the oil textures I put down, the lines still looked a little bit sharp in this area, so I'm going to use the gravel theme decal to soften that up a bit. I wanted this area to look a bit more used because we're going to have some equipment and materials staged here, so I changed the color of the decals just a little bit to have it stand out and make it look more trafficked. The next build is a new depot for the city's streetcar system, where we're going to house and maintain a brand new fleet of vehicles. Obviously, Duluth doesn't have streetcars in real life anymore. Aww. So I had to look elsewhere for inspiration, and I figured that the Twin Cities Light Rail Depot would be a good spot to look at. I didn't recreate it or anything because it's a couple times bigger than the one that we're going to build, but I did take a few details from it when I wasn't sure exactly what to do. I thought that this spot between the interchange and the rail yard would be a good fit because of this kind of tapered shape, which will allow for an interesting shape for the rail yard. It also has a close proximity to the main streetcar line, which is helpful, obviously. And kind of this whole area would have been bought by the city when they rerouted the main avenue and built the freeway interchange. So they would have just taken over this whole area of land and had this nice spot to build in. The only issue is that there's a relatively steep slope on one side because the entire interchange area is up on a big embankment, if you'll remember back to that build. So I decided that it would be best just to have the whole facility up on the embankment at the same level as the streetcar tracks. To get this thing functional, I clipped in this tram depot block service. It's a little tricky to put down because you have to put down a road first and kind of estimate where it's going to be. But I got that down and we'll of course connect all these up to the road system momentarily. First, I had a little bit of a problem, which is that these tram track assets, as beautiful as they are, I don't think were really made for this kind of build. I made the very painful decision to remove all of these tracks and instead use the same Railway 2 train tracks that we used for the rail yard. So using those, I was able to get some more tight turns and connections. And I guess because you have like shorter trains or more articulation or something in streetcars, I was able to do some of these kind of more, I don't know, like squat connections that you get in light rail depots. The big issue with doing it this way, obviously, is that tram vehicles aren't going to use train tracks, not even after a little bit of training. So I had to take some of these vanilla tram tracks to make functional connections between the depot itself and the road. And I'm also going to add a little loop that goes around the rail yard so we can have a dummy line running through here to give the build a little bit of life. And in order to do that, I only had to sacrifice a small amount of my life to manually align all the tram tracks with the train tracks so that it looks like the streetcars that go along this are actually going along the tracks. So with all this functionality potentially taken care of at least, I made a short dummy line that loops through the facility and just stops at a random point along the main avenue. And that's going to get a single vehicle on it so that we can get a small trickle of activity coming in and out of the yard. For the vehicles, I'm using these, I think they're called the City Line things. Wow, that was eloquent. But I really like the livery on these. It feels generic enough that it could fit into just about any city, but it still has a really nice design on it, so it's not boring. Just have to follow along this thing as it goes around the dummy line and adjust the tram tracks a little bit more to match the curve of the track as it goes along that. I'm not aiming for perfection, but I didn't want it to look like it was going too far off the rails. I'm also going to update the remainder of the streetcar lines with the same vehicles so that everything looks nice and cohesive, like they just got in a big order of new rolling stock, and all of the lines have the same livery and vehicles. I'm going to keep one of the vintage streetcars running on the main line because that's just a lot of fun to have, I think. Much like with the previous rail yard, the detailing for this build isn't going to be too crazy. I mostly wanted to focus on practical aspects of the facility, so we're going to add in some doors to make it look like trains can actually get in and out of the building, which is pretty useful for realism. And I'm going to add some gravel and pavement as well to define the different areas of the yard, which is fairly straightforward. I'm just using some theme props in IMT along the curved areas because it's a lot easier to do it that way. And then some manually placed props for the bigger areas. And of course, I'm going to fit in some parking spots wherever we can for the workers, because I guess they have to get the trains running and they can't take the train to work, unfortunately. The facility was a little bit tricky around back because we have this big embankment. I suppose that I could have done a big retaining wall or something to make it more straightforward, but I didn't feel like the density around here really warranted that kind of thing. And so we need to do a few things to take care of that. There's this awkward gap where the road begins to slope down a bit, and instead of trying to PO in a really awkward piece of gravel prop, I just covered it in bushes. You know, sometimes you just have to admit defeat, do the easy thing and the lazy thing, and move on. Thankfully, there was a bit more real estate over here, so I was able to use some terraforming roads to pull the upper level out a bit without sacrificing the smoothness of the slope, which I feel like you need for a good-looking embankment, I guess. And then I could just plop down this fence network with a reasonable slope and match it up with the ones I did in IMT. I mean, sometimes you do see fences that go down really hilariously steep slopes, but I feel like a transit depot needs to be a little bit more serious than that. I did come back and plop down a few little details that I thought were missing from the depot. There's this cool animated bus washer thing, which I think is meant to be a standalone piece that hangs out in the open, but I thought it would be cool to clip it into this open door bit of the facility. So this is going to allow for a fun little cinematic where you can watch the streetcars come in one side and come out the other side squeaky clean. With the only catch being that they also came in squeaky clean, but I won't tell anyone if you don't. A couple of other things. There's a little office area around the side, which features fully functional office blocks and 2 pathetic trees. So that's fun. And then there's a little extremely generic storage area around back with a shed and a couple of containers, and I just figured that they would need a separate area to store vehicles and materials and that kind of stuff. Oh, and there's also this 2-track rail yard, which is maybe not big enough, but it's what we have space for. And I'm going to put down some of our new trains on here, as well as one of the vintage cars and the legacy rolling stock as well. I just couldn't bring myself to totally remove it from the city, so we're going to have one hanging out here, and maybe they use it during peak times or for certain events or something like that. So that is the little streetcar depot all done. And all that's left is to delete the old vanilla one that has been moving around the city throughout the series as I try to keep it out of sight in the background of the cinematics, usually not very successfully. So for the person who kept asking for this to get deleted, now you can celebrate. Across the street from the streetcar depot, we're going to build a brand new bus depot. So pretty much the same story as the streetcar depot. This is going to be part of this same development where they buy this land and then build up all these new services. I wanted a very generic and big building for this thing, but not one that's so generic that it becomes boring and not very noticeable in the background. Weirdly enough, the one I settled on was this warehouse building, which I've actually already used in the industrial area. So I thought that I would just change it up a little bit by adding a color rectangle and changing it into this kind of like reddish pink color. Is that mauve, I guess? I don't know. Anyway, it has a nice and presentable face around front to show off to the main avenue, which I feel like is important if I'm going this route. Plus, it already has some garage entrances built in, so I think that it fits the bill pretty nicely for this project. For the functionality, I'm going to clip in a bus depot service block, of course, which now that I'm thinking about it was probably not the best idea because I already had a placeholder one, so I could have just moved that in here and saved myself a lot of work that I'm about to make you watch. Just like before, I made a short dummy line to get some bus traffic trickling in and out of the depot. And then I went through and changed all of our pre-existing bus lines to use this depot, and I also replaced our fleet of buses with some of the ones from this, I think it's from the same line as the streetcars that we're using. So it has a variety of buses, including some cool hybrid ones, so we'll be seeing those drive around the city as we progress through the series, which I think is really nice to have a nice matching fleet of vehicles. I'm not going to show you every line here, but I think you get the idea about the process just from seeing these couple of main lines. As adorable as the depot is so far, I wanted it to make a much bigger impact on the satellite view. So to do that, I'm going to add 4 entire rows of outdoor bus parking, which I'm sure is going to be popular with the bus drivers in the winter. So I'm going to add like 2 little blocks of street here just to space things out properly, and then randomly copy in some of these buses. I did feel a little bit bad for the drivers though, so I'm going to yoink this roof from the storage yard that we built last episode and add that in here just above the boarding area, so it stays fairly clear and dry when it dumps snow. Because the lot is right up against the main avenue as it starts sloping back down to ground level, I was forced to add a bit of a retaining wall here. We are going to hold on to the embankment around back because there's a lot more space there. And I'll detail that up off screen in the same way that we did for the streetcar depot. Finally, and just about the only spot that I had any space left, I realized that we didn't have any way to fuel our buses. So I'm going to build a small fueling station here with a couple of tanks. I'm also going to drag the dummy line over here so that the buses stop here. I didn't build any charging stations or anything like that for the hybrids, mostly because I didn't think of it, but we can say that there are charging ports underneath the roofs so that they can get all juiced up. I probably should have stopped building right there, and we could have had a nice 20-minute video for once. But I was having such a good time with this build that I decided to keep going. We're going to have one build on either side of the main rail line here, one being an industrial build that's interfaced with the main line, and the other being just some trailer storage for the public terminal. And we're going to start up top with the industrial build. I made a bit more room by trimming back some of the old street grid here so we can have this nice elongated pocket of land here that happens to be shaped a bit like an ear of corn, I guess. I wanted something fairly big and bulky here, so what I settled on is a big aggregate storage yard. I don't know if that's what it's called, but that's what I call it. I had been looking around Cleveland a little bit for inspiration for a future build, and you get all kinds of yards like this scattered around the industrial area. So I think that having all these big piles in this location really catches your eye in a way that other industrial facilities don't. So I felt like having something in this vicinity like that would help kind of bring a little bit more appeal to the industrial area. I never thought that I would say a pile of rocks brings appeal to anything, but here we go. Anyway, because this lot is shaped like an ear of corn, the surfaces were a little bit more interesting than usual to put down. I mostly used pavement props in IMT along the rail and the service road to outline the shape, and then filled in the rest of it with surface painter. I fenced the entire thing off at great expense to my mental health, unfortunately, and then got to the most interesting bit of the build, which is the actual stuff that happens here. So basically what they do, this is my view of industry, by the way, this does not necessarily represent real life, is they shunt in these gondola cars from the collection that I plopped down earlier. They scoop out the rocks using an excavator and transfer them to the big piles. I don't know if that is actually as interesting as it sounded before I said it out loud, but this excavator prop is animated, so that's kind of interesting. We usually don't do too much of that in this series. On the functional side of things, I really had no idea what kind of stuff goes on here beyond piling up rocks, but I wanted there to be some logic to the facility. So we have this silo where they store certain components, I guess, and that empties out into these cement mixers, and then you somehow have concrete, I guess. I'm sure that's not how it works at all, but the point here is that I can clip a warehouse block in, set it to store ore products, also known as rocks, and then we can have dump trucks and mixers coming and going from this facility thing. The next build will be pretty short, so I'm not going to keep you too much longer. We didn't really have a good spot for storing trailers in the public terminal build from the last couple episodes, but I thought that it was something the port needed in order to reflect the increased container capacity that I talked about in that build. I figured it would make sense that the city could have bought up this plot of land, maybe around the same time they renovated the dock immediately across the street to expand the terminal, and use this for trailer storage. It was a relatively straightforward build. I used the big parking lot roads here to get the nice grassy curb around the outside, and then dealt with the interior using a clipping network to get rid of the grass, and then filling in the resulting void to hell with some asphalt props. There's also this concrete pad over to one side, which may look weird, but I think it'll make sense in a moment. I don't know exactly how these sorts of operations work. Have you noticed a theme in this episode? But around intermodal ports, you tend to see lots that have lines and lines and lines of empty trailers staged there. And sometimes you even have trailers mixed in with containers on them. So that's exactly what I'm going to add here, mostly using IMT, with the bulk of them being empties. Like I said, I did want to have a few of them loaded up with trailers. It was easier to use props for those so that I could vary the type of trailer more easily. And then there was a little bit of space in between the rows of trailers, so I filled it in with a median for some reason. It probably would have been better just to push the trailers closer toward the middle, giving them more space to pull out, but I think the median looks kind of cool, so that's going to stay. So my thought for the concrete pad over on this side is that you'd have some trailers stored more long-term, so that if you had a surge in trailer use, you could draw from this. And I guess that concrete takes static weight better, so that's why it's a different texture. Actually, it's different because I thought it looked cool, but we can have some after-the-fact rationalization. That never hurt anybody ever. Anyway, I tried to fit this in against this old stretch of track heading in toward the abandoned dock, but I thought that it felt a little weird to limit the size of a new facility based on an unused piece of rail. So I decided to rip that up and make this part of the lot square, which just seems like a better use of space overall. This track here is still in use though, so I'm going to keep that along with the abandoned stretch of road, which I think is going to look really cool here after surrounding it with a bit of overgrowth and then busting it up with a variety of decals. Beautiful. And with that final touch, we are done with whatever this build is supposed to be. I guess the rail yard, transit depot, pile of rocks, trailer storage, abandoned road build. But regardless of what I'm going to title this video, I hope you enjoyed watching this build as much as I did building it. Thank you to my wonderful channel members, with a special shout out to my $5 tier members, New, Peter J, and Victor Sellen. And thank you for watching. Corn. That sounds good.